So this previous weekend, we had the second race at Silverstone, the 70th Anniversary Grand Prix, and this was a really good race to watch. And the main reason for this is because somebody other than Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas won. So if you didn't see, Mercedes did not win this race. Max Verstappen of Red Bull, who has been really their only challenger this year, ended up beating them. And so what I want to do for this race is just kind of go team by team and just sort of give a breakdown of how their performances went over the course of the race, basically. So I'm going to do this in order of how the team's best driver finished. So we'll look at Red Bull first, since Max Verstappen won, then Mercedes, etc. So let's go ahead and start off with Red Bull. So obviously, great race from Verstappen. He ended up beating Mercedes. It was a good race from Albon as well, but the problem with Albon is he needs to improve his qualifying. So once again, Max Verstappen qualified fourth, ended up winning the race, and this is because he had a different strategy going into the race than everyone else. So he started in qualifying. He used hard tires for the qualifying. And in Formula One, whatever tires you use for for your qualifying session, you have to use the same tires to start the race. And Silverstone this weekend was a hot track. Temperatures on the track were getting up to 40 degrees Celsius, which is around 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the American viewers, which is everyone. Trust me, I get confused watching the races too. They show everything in Celsius and kilometers per hour. All that junk. Anyway, so this meant that while Verstappen's tires were a little slower during qualifying because he did place fourth, he did make up the gap throughout the race, and the durability of the tires and his tire management really went a long way. He stayed on the track for a very long time in that first set of hards. He got out to such a great lead because Mercedes, we'll discuss later, were having their own tire problems. He was right along Valtteri Bottas when he came out of the pits from eventually pitting, and he was a full pit stop ahead of Lewis Hamilton. And he was able to pass Valtteri within like 2 or 3 corners maybe. And from that point on, it was basically smooth sailing for Max Verstappen. Really good stuff out of him. Very consistent effort for Max. And he showed that when Mercedes has an off day like this, he can expose their weaknesses and take advantage of them and really put on a good performance. So congrats to Max Verstappen being the first non-Mercedes driver to win a race this year. As for his teammate, Alex Albon, he had a really good race as well, finished 5th. But it just begs the question of when can he put it all together for Red Bull and finally get a podium. So this week he qualifies 9th on the grid to start off. Last week at the same track, Silverstone, qualifies 12th, and because of this finishes 8th. Week before that at Hungary, qualifies 13th, but then manages to finish 5th. Then at the Styrian Grand Prix at the Red Bull Ring, second race of the year, he qualified 7th, but then comes back to finish 4th. And then the first race of the year, he qualified 5th, which is his best qualifying to date, but that was obviously the Lewis Hamilton where he got punted off the track, spun out, and then eventually he would retire due to a power unit issue anyway. People discussed whether or not he could have won the race. It looked like he was ready to win the race if it hadn't been for the power unit. Anyway, the point is, he obviously has the stuff to win a race, whether it be him or the car. I think that he can get on that podium. It's just a matter of his qualifying. His qualifying, as we've seen, has been, for Red Bull standards, pretty bad this season. And this could be on Albon being bad at qualifying, or is this on maybe Red Bull, like we saw last year a little bit with Pierre Gasly, where they were sort of prioritizing Max Verstappen and kind of pushing Gasly off to the side, not really giving him the attention that he needed in the practice sessions and the qualifying. But if Red Bull ever wants to, in the future, get a sniff at the Drivers' Championship against Mercedes, they need their second guy, who I think can be Albon. I think Albon has the driving alone to be their second guy. I think he's much better than Gasly ever was in that second seat already. But he simply needs to qualify better. And that's my main knack on Alex Albon. Is that they're second this year because of Ferrari's woes, basically driving like a midfield team. But they cannot count on that every year. And whether that be changing out their second guy or giving Albon some more support, giving him better qualifying strategies, these are the steps Red Bull needs to take. Verstappen's always going to do well. He's shown time and time again, whatever car he's in, whatever situation, he will put out a good drive for you. And it's the second guy, really, that they need to give help, and they need to figure out how to get the most out of him without sacrificing Verstappen's time and effort they put into him, because it's obviously going to pay dividends for them to do that. Now, let's go over to the Mercedes side of things. So even with their tire blistering, they still finished second and third, right? And it just shows that they're still just so far ahead of everyone else. But they could also struggle next week at Barcelona in Spain, which is also expected to be a pretty hot track. And like I said before, both drivers suffered from tire blistering. So what had happened was, it was a very hot day. Everyone in the top 10 started on medium tires, except for Max Verstappen, as previously mentioned. And Mercedes were really having a terrible time. You could see it on the television. There was just these lines running through the tires as they were going by. The blistering happening. So you're not getting as much grip, as much traction, not putting as much power down into the tarmac. And they still managed to finish second and third with this issue. It just boggles me how good Mercedes is. So there are a couple things to talk about with them, though. Lewis Hamilton finished second. Tire troubles all day, but he got some help with being second, mainly due to his team strategy. We will talk about that with Valtteri. He has, the best car on the grid, the best tire management on the grid out of any driver. And there's not really much to say there. Had a Lewis Hamilton race, if you will, even with the tire troubles. However, Valtteri Bottas, who qualified first, was on the pole for this race, leading it. He got screwed out of second place, I think, by his team strategy. So Mercedes had Valtteri Bottas, who was the team leader, or who was the race leader, ahead of Max Verstappen, way sooner than Lewis did. Meaning that when Lewis came into the pits later, he was eventually on the fresher tires, and it made it easier for him to eventually take P2 away from Valtteri. And this is almost a trouble in paradise situation, if you will. Oh, he finished P3 instead of P2. He still got a podium, whatever. But Valtteri was the better qualifier, and he led the race. He was in front of Verstappen until he was told to pit. And while it's very clear that Valtteri is the number 2 driver at Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton is the face of the sport. There's no way you're not going to prioritize him. In a race like this, where you have Valtteri leading, and where he qualifies first, it seems like he should be the one getting the priority. And yes, it's Lewis's home circuit, I get that, and he just had one last week. But moments like these little things here, these are what cause drivers to eventually leave. And Valtteri has been a great driver in this respect. He has been someone who has basically shut his mouth, kept to himself, done what is expected of him. He is a great second man for this Mercedes team, especially behind, as we've seen before, a very outspoken Lewis Hamilton at times. But that resentment eventually could begin to grow, and he could eventually leave this Mercedes team. Toto Wolff, who is a team principal for Mercedes, basically head coach equivalent of other sports, he came out after the race and said that they brought Valtteri in because they thought the tire wear was more severe than it originally was, and they decided to keep Lewis out a couple more laps after looking at the tires and evaluating the tire wear, which, that's cool. He can say whatever he wants, but I think it's pretty obvious why Valtteri, who's the race leader at that point, was brought in before Lewis. I'm not suggesting by any means this will lead to any turmoil this year. Valtteri Bottas is already locked up for next year in that second slot for Mercedes. But down the road, don't be surprised to see Valtteri Bottas, who has been an excellent teammate for Lewis Hamilton, up to this point, stayed quiet, stayed respectful. Don't expect him to stay happy with finishing second to Lewis all the time. So while both Mercedes did struggle for their standards, still finished second and third, both podiums. Next week, we will really see at a hot Barcelona track, though, if Mercedes can come over these tire issues that they had. See if it was the temporary lapse in the Mercedes machine of winning and domination. So then let's look at Ferrari next. And Ferrari, this is basically the same story they've had all year. Charles Leclerc did well, had a pretty good race, and Sebastian Vettel did not. Very sad to see from such a prominent team in the sport who's been around basically since the start. They're a midfield team this year. Charles Leclerc is just every race dragging a car to the line that's a midfield car, and he's putting it on podiums, putting it in fourth place. And it seems that Vettel cannot do anything with his car. And this is really souring his relationship with Ferrari. We'll talk about that a little later. Let's focus on Charles Leclerc a little bit for now. Qualified 8th, finished 4th. He once again just proves that he's a future star, or not a future star. He's a star of the sport, but he could potentially be a future face with Max Verstappen. Monster drive, dragging this car to 4th place. Just, this car isn't getting it done this year. And to me, it further cements his status as the second best rising star in the sport. I think Verstappen gets the edge because he seems to get slightly more out of his cars now, and I think that the Red Bull car, at least from years previously, is a objectively worse car than the Ferrari would normally be. That's obviously not the case this year. And Mercedes, he's able to challenge the Mercedes in a Red Bull car, which usually would finish third otherwise, I think, with another driver. So while Charles Leclerc had a great race, his teammate Sebastian Vettel just can't get anything going with the Ferrari, and it continues to make Sebastian look like he's making the right decision and leaving, at least for this year. It just does not seem like Ferrari's putting in the effort with Vettel this year, and, it makes sense because he isn't going to be coming back, so why would Ferrari care about developing a relationship with him, putting in all this extra time, effort to make things right when Vettel's just going to leave anyway? However, it does set the precedent for future drivers, such as a young Carlos Sainz from McLaren, who they have coming in next year. So the question is, how will he feel coming into this situation? Having beaten that Ferrari car from Vettel multiple times this year in his McLaren. Next year will be interesting for sure for Carlos Sainz to see how Ferrari adjusts to the change, if they can do any better. But for Sebastian Vettel, how does this look for him? He's consistently doing bad in races like this for Ferrari standards. Because Leclerc is still getting decent results. And you could say that while Seb is salty, for Ferrari not wanting to keep him, that is causing him to coast through the year, which is understandable. If you're not going to be with this team for long, it makes sense, to just go in the corner and pout about it and whatnot. But it does ask the question, what will potential future suitors think of this? So while they can take this as Ferrari screwing Vettel over and not really caring that much, or they could also take it as Vettel not caring enough now that he's gonna knows that he's gonna be gone. So either way though, I don't think that these results will help Vettel at all. He's aging, he's getting up there. It's pretty clear at this point that he wants to be a first seat driver for a winning team, and there aren't just many spots for that available in the sport right now, especially when you have so many bright young guys who would willing to be taking a number 2 role even. We're seeing this with Carlos Sainz. He's been a great number 2 driver for another young driver, Lando Norris, at McLaren, and it really does ask the question, will Vettel even be on an F1 team next year? I think while he does deserve a seat in F1, I'm not sure if he will want to take a midfield seat. So pretty sad to see this happening to him. All the best for him going forward. Hopefully he does get a seat in F1 because he's a great driver to watch. Always been a class act. So for Ferrari, summing things up, Charles Leclerc continues to impress in a midfield car, and Sebastian Vettel seems to be coasting through the year without concern for where he finishes, really. Hopefully Ferrari can turn things around next year. This has been, to say a disaster this year would be a little bit of an understatement for them. They were supposed to be challenging Mercedes, for the Drivers' Cup. And that's not happening this year. Best of luck to Ferrari going forward. Hopefully they can figure it out. So the next best team finishes came from Racing Point. And even with getting knocked down by a points penalty, they'll still put in good results. They seem to be challenging to be the best of the rest so far. So for those of you who did not hear, they received a 15,400,000 euro, which is around $470,000 in the U.S. Penalty for having the same rear brake duct design from Mercedes from their championship car last year. So it's no secret that that Mercedes had been selling parts to Racing Point, right? And everyone has been calling them, the pink Mercedes, how they're just copying Mercedes. And this basically just proves that point, right? So what had happened was Mercedes had sold them the designs for the rear brake ducts, and they copied them this year, which wasn't an issue in the past, but with the new rules coming into 2020, the FIA determined that it was a problem, and so they took care of it. But they also said that it's not going to affect them for the rest of the year. They're just going to give them this penalty here, and they want them next year to change it and not use those designs. So let's talk about the actual racers for now. So Lance Stroll continues to get, I think, a little too much hate for being a pay driver, which is pretty clear he is. But I think he's also proven himself to be someone who can stay in this Racing Point / Aston Martin seat for a long time. He qualified 6th and he finished 6th, which is about the best you can ask for at the circuit with the cars that were ahead of him. So for those of you who don't know, when I talk about a pay driver is someone who comes into a team strictly because they have a lot of money or because they have a lot of sponsorships they will bring in. And this is the case with Lance Stroll because, pardon me, I got a lot of crap in my throat today. So his dad, Lawrence Stroll, is literally the team owner of Racing Point. So for many, as long as Daddy is the owner of the team and has a say in the matter, money-wise, Stroll's always going to have a seat guaranteed in this team. Now, this makes a lot of people angry. They get really upset over this. They call him a pay driver, say, Daddy's seat, whatever. But this doesn't mean that Lance deserves all this hate he receives. Because I believe this year especially, he's shown that he can be a solid driver on the grid. And he can be someone that can be competitive for 4th, 5th place, consistently in races. Since the start, when he and seemingly everyone else DNF'd at the first race back at the Red Bull Ring, he has yet to finish outside of the top 10, even getting as high as P4 at Hungary 2 weeks ago. And he's solid at qualifying. So he will continue, I think, to put solid drives behind the wheel of this Racing Point and Aston Martin in the future when they later change. And he could be a fantastic second driver in the future if they want to bring in somebody, maybe like a Sebastian Vettel for next year or 2 years. Who knows? But for now, for Lance Stroll, he just needs to continue to put his head down, put in the work, and prove himself in the old-fashioned way, and really prove all of these haters and doubters wrong. So that's Lance Stroll. Now let's talk about the replacement driver for this week and last week, Nico Hülkenberg. So he was filling in for Sergio Perez, who was out with COVID-19, and he was really good in qualifying this week. Really impressive. Qualified on a podium, Q3, but he wasn't good enough in the race, simply put. He finished behind his teammate, finished in 7th. And these past 2 races, to me, really haven't helped Nico in the respects of getting a future seat in Formula 1 for a mid-tier team. Last week, he qualified 13th, and he didn't get a chance to prove himself in that race, however, because his car wouldn't even get off the starting line. But this week, he really had a chance to prove himself. You qualify 3rd, and he just kind of blew it, I think. He finished below his teammate even, Lance Stroll, who qualified 6th, who finished in the same position. So I really am not sure that this will put much confidence in these mid-table teams who may want to pick someone up, especially when, Nico is already 32 years old, definitely on the latter end of his career, and there's still plenty of young talent out there, whether it be in the academy or just out on the grid in general. So I really do feel bad for Nico because he is someone who's fun to watch. He's really easy to like. But, in all of his years of racing, he still doesn't have a podium in F1. And I think that's kind of telling of the driver who he is. He's very respectable, very likable guy, but he just doesn't quite have what it takes to really push his team to the next level. So I really do feel bad for him. So Racing Point, at this point in the year, are kind of the villains, right? Sort of the self-diagnosed villains of the rest. But I do still think that they're putting out good results, even if they do copy Mercedes. So, with Racing Point, a lot of people say they copy Mercedes. It's the only reason why they win is because they copy Mercedes. Well, if the FIA isn't going to do anything about it, which they have this year, it looks like, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they say to themselves, hey, we can build the championship car from last year. If you could do that, if you were in this position where you literally had the opportunity to build the championship winning car from last year, put it in your car, would you do it to get some wins? I think I would. Is it the right thing to do? Maybe not. You could say that. But overall, I think that Racing Point is getting a little too much hate. And I get it. I understand why people are angry at them. But don't get mad at them. Get mad at the FIA for not putting their foot down and not enforcing this soon enough. So those are my thoughts on Racing Point. I hope that they continue to have good results. I like both their drivers, Lance Stroll and Sergio Perez. Hopefully he can come back and do well next week, because that's when he is coming back. So the next team on the grid who finished, Renault. Really great result from Esteban Ocon. Ricciardo, not so much, although Renault been letting him down ever since he's been here. So let's talk about Esteban Ocon. He qualified 11th, finished in 8th. This year he's really been proving that he's still a good, feisty driver who can cause competition for the first driver, for better or for worse. He really hit his groove his past couple of races. Silverstone last week, he finished 6th. And he hasn't finished below his qualifying spot in any race this year besides the first race where everybody was DNFing. So hopefully he can keep this momentum going. I like him as a driver. He's got a lot of heart, got a lot of drive. And while he's very passionate about his racing. This does get him into trouble at times. He gets a little overzealous in moments. He takes some moves, keeps his spot where he probably shouldn't. And this will lead to tension between teammates at times. This is what happened at the Racing Point / Force India team. Him and Sergio Perez had, they went back and forth. I think at one point they even wrecked each other. So it'll be interesting to see how next year, with Ricciardo leaving, you have Fernando Alonso coming in, who is known to be a brat when it comes to, priority, and just overall his attitude has never been very good in the sport. So it'll be interesting to see how Esteban Ocon, who is someone who is in the past known to sort of get on the nerves a little bit of the first driver, to see how those two will get along. And that should be a very interesting talking point there. As for Daniel Ricciardo, he qualified 5th, finished in 14th. Really disappointing result this race. in what has been a really solid year for the Aussie so far. He finished fourth at the same track last week, and he hadn't had a finish before this except for eighth, except for that DNF at the beginning of the year, which everyone else had basically. And I still think that he's one of the best drivers on the grid. He just has a car that has consistently let him down over the past 2 years. It's really sad to see Daniel Ricciardo, such a talented driver in his prime years, having them wasted at Renault. Well, he could still, potentially have been at Red Bull with Max Verstappen, tearing up the courses, potentially winning drives, winning championships. It's really sad to see from Ricciardo. Hopefully he does better next year at McLaren. Hopefully they give him a better car to use. So Renault this year are 6th in the constructors standings so far. This kind of perfectly sums them up as a team. Toward the bottom of the midfield teams, even with having 2 solid drivers. That's my thing with Renault. They just cannot build a strong enough car to support their team. And it's really sad to see because I think Esteban Ocon is a pretty decent driver, and I think Ricciardo is still a top 5 driver on the grid. So hopefully next year, Renault can sort of beef their car up and get a little more competitive. So now let's talk about that team that Ricciardo is going to next year, McLaren. This week was a really disappointing result from them. And so far, they've been excellent this year. They've had looks of the best of the rest. You have Lando Norris, who this race couldn't really do anything, qualified 10th, finished 9th, but he has had a phenomenal year. This year he really got put on the map. P3 at the Red Bull Ring, has only finished outside of the top 5 this race. This is the only race he has. And at Hungary, where he also qualified pretty poorly. And he's only 20 years old in that F1 seat. He's younger than I am. That's crazy to think. He is a stud in the making. McLaren have a star in their hands. He's, I would say, the 3rd best driver out of that young core, out of Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc. And then I think you have Lando Norris in that next spot. He's currently 5th in the driver standings, which places him firmly in the hunt for the best of the rest of the drivers. So really proud of Lando Norris. He's such a good kid. Really has a positive attitude, always making jokes. Always a fun guy to watch. So Carlos Sainz, his teammate. He qualified 13th and finished there. Also had a bad results for his standards this year. And he looks to continue on his solid resume before he heads off to a worse team. Those are just jokes. It might not be a worse team next year, but Ferrari looks like a worse team this year. He has done what has been asked of him as a second driver. He lets the first seat guy, which is Lando Norris, pretty clearly, get all the glory while he grinds out for some points. With this race on the last, it's the only times this year where he's finished outside of the points. And he kind of has to be asking himself, why am I leaving this team with what's happening next year, with Ferrari and what's happened this year with Vettel? Obviously, you can't pass up the opportunity to take a seat in the Scarlet Red car. That's a prestigious brand, and he's probably getting paid a pretty penny to do it as well. But he will be questioning this year, at least, if they can be better when he gets there. I think that when he does get there, he'll be a great number 2 for Charles Leclerc, nonetheless, and he will stay out of his way, which is the most important part, and that's what Ferrari wants, right? They know Charles Leclerc is their guy going forward, and they want Sainz to be that second guy, and I think that Carlos Sainz, taking this role, knew what he was getting into, and I think that he's perfectly fine with that. So McLaren this year, they've been excellent. They've been, for my money, the best of the rest. For what was expected of them coming in the year. Just off their game at Britain, it seems, which sucks considering technically this is their home circuit, because McLaren is British. But overall, good season so far from McLaren. Next, let's talk about the AlphaTauri team. This is Red Bull's secondary team that they have on the grid. And Pierre Gasly has been great for them this year. Now he's got the pressure of Red Bull off of him. He said this himself. He doesn't want to go back to that second seat at Red Bull. He really likes it in the AlphaTauri cars. Very obvious. While Danny Kvyat has really struggled as per the course. Pierre Gasly wasn't quite as good as he's been. He qualified 7th, finished just outside the points at 11. but he still has put in really good drives with the AlphaTauri this year. He has said, like I said before, Red Bull seat is not in his calling, and it really, to me, does show how much more comfortable he is driving with the second team. He's finished 7th multiple times this year, well within the points, and that's all you could ask from the AlphaTauri being a secondary car, to the Red Bull. So it's very good to see him in a happy place. Whereas Daniel Kvyat, he had a really good drive this race. He qualified 16th, pretty bad, but did finish 10th inside the points. This is definitely his best drive of the year. And hopefully this is the spark for him that he hasn't been able to find for the entire year. This is just his second time finishing within the points. First was at the Styrian Grand Prix, the Red Bull Ring. But I'm not sure how many more races he can be competitive and get points with the AlphaTauri. Another Academy driver might get the spot in the future if Red Bull feels that Kvyat is sort of meddling in the place, or if they want to bring in somebody to replace Albon down the future. They're going to have to bring them into the AlphaTauri team first to really get their feet wet. So, it really is a question, how long will Kvyat stay here with these sort of disappointing meddling results, if you will. So AlphaTauri had a pretty good race, and they've been pretty decent this year. As you would say, Pierre Gasly has been, for my money, excellent for this team. He's really been happy here. It's just Daniel Kvyat who's really been having the issues. So now let's talk about the rest. And what I mean by the rest is the bottom feeders. So you have Alfa Romeo, Haas, and Williams. These guys are all bottom feeders. Anytime I talk about F1, they will only come up maybe a little bit. Maybe I'll mention a guy here or there. And that's what I'm doing this week. I'm just going to mention a guy from one of these teams that I feel like actually deserves the attention. And that is George Russell. George Russell's the only guy I want to talk about here. And he qualifies so well in such a terrible car. He qualified 12th this race with the Williams car. He still finished 18th, and to me, this isn't his fault. He's qualified 12th in this race, and at the second Austrian race, the Styrian Grand Prix, and at Hungary. And it's really a shame that his car can't keep up with others in the race, or it seems to break down every time he's having a great race. And I would really love to see him take that second seat at Mercedes in the coming years. I think he'd be great number 2 with Lewis in the twilight of his career. And I think he could eventually look to take that first seat from Lewis whenever he decides to go off into the sunset. So I really like George Russell's outlook. I really like how he's driven this year. Really gotten a chance to prove himself in this Williams car. And I think his results in qualifying alone show that he has the potential to be a great driver for a better team. So then with that, let's look currently at the constructor standings. You have Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari at the top, followed by McLaren, Racing Point after that penalty, Renault, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, Haas, and then Williams. Then the driver standings, you have Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, Valtteri Bottas as the top 3. You then have Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, Alex Albon, Lance Stroll, and Sergio Perez, all sort of in the midfield battle, as well as Daniel Ricciardo and Esteban Ocon, sort of an outside look for the top 10 drivers. So some interesting battles to look for here at the constructors and driver standings is Ferrari versus McLaren. First off, can the consistency of McLaren outpace the excellence of Charles Leclerc? Basically the whole year, Charles Leclerc has finished really well. Seb has finished really poorly, whereas for the McLaren side of things, both guys have finished very consistently in the midfield and done very well. Also, Racing Point versus the rest. So can they make up the ground they've lost after the 15-point penalty with their solid driving duo of Perez and Stroll? This will be very interesting to look at. I think as this week showed, I think with Lance Stroll, he'll be just fine. We'll have to see when Sergio Perez comes back. Also, Max Verstappen versus Valtteri Bottas. Max Verstappen's at 77 points right now. Valtteri Bottas is at 73. So can Verstappen hold off the Mercedes driver to finally take second in this Drivers' Championship? He's really been overshadowed by the Mercedes for years. He's really trying to break out of that and show what he can do. You also have Charles Leclerc versus Lando Norris versus Alex Albon. Leclerc leads this battle with 45 points, followed by Norris at 38. Then you have the Red Bull driver at 36 points. They are all sitting 4, 5, and 6 respectively in the Drivers' Championship. So will Ferrari's woes this year hold back Leclerc from topping Norris, who is currently thriving, currently the hot driver on the grid, besides Charles Leclerc? And then can Albon improve his qualifying to have a chance at taking fourth in the standings? This will be a very interesting question to see if they get answered. You also then have Lance Stroll versus Sergio Perez, the teammates there, and Daniel Ricciardo and Esteban Ocon, teammates at Renault. You have Lance Stroll at 28 points, Sergio Perez at 22, and then you have Daniel Ricciardo at 20 points and Esteban Ocon at 16. So the main question here is, who will prove better between the two respective drivers at each team? Will we see the young, feisty Ocon be able to take some spots away from the young vet? What am I saying? The older vet in Daniel Ricciardo? And can you see Sergio Perez sort of take that next step to get past Lance Stroll, and especially to get back on the track after having dealt with this COVID-19 stuff, missing out on some points that he could potentially could have gotten? And there's only really one way to find out, and that's to see the end of the year and let the driving speak for itself. And then this is my most important question of the year. This is the question we have to have answered this year. Williams versus points. Can Williams score a single point this year? This is the question. They were so close at the first race of the year. There were 9 cars that got retired, leaving 10 cars in the points and 1 car out of the points. Guess who that 1 car was out of the points? It was a Williams. These poor guys. Haas has scored a point this year by virtue of that race. They've had a really good season so far for their standards, especially with George Russell. It's just, it's like, come on, George Russell, please give us a point. If George Russell finishes in the top 10 this year, that will be honestly insane. I'm really hoping so. I really like George Russell. I think that will really prove that he has what it takes to be a great F1 driver. If he can be a great F1 driver in this trash Williams car. So overall, so far, for the entire outlook of the Formula One season, really good season so far, I feel like. Besides Mercedes being the top dog and everything for the whole year by a long shot, there have been some surprise teams doing very well. You have McLaren and Racing Point have really taken the next step. Some teams have been really disappointing. Ferrari, Haas has been another one that's been very disappointing. And how shaken up in general, really, the standings have been this year. So I think that overall, this will be one of the most exciting ends to a Formula One season we've had in quite some time. Mainly for the midfield, not so much for the top. We've already established that we've got Hamilton, Bottas, Verstappen. One of those orders, probably Hamilton at the top, unfortunately. But it'll be interesting to see how the rest of the field finishes out this year.